Cool! Hello everyone! My name is Wesley, this is Woo Can Cook. Today we're doing a type of chow mein. I guess it's one of the many types of chow mein that you could find. If you don't know what chow mein is, I would be really surprised. But if you don't know what chow mein is, it's probably one of the more popular noodle dishes that come up in a lot of Chinese cuisine here at least here in the States. The particular version of chow mein that we're doing today is actually my mom's favorite chow mein, or at least what I remember when we were kids. She used to order it a lot, which is a tomato beef chow mein, which uses whole tomatoes in it for a kind of like a sweet and savory sort of chow mein. I remember when I was a kid that I did not particularly like this chow mein because it uses whole tomatoes, and I don't think I liked tomatoes when I was a kid. So, but as I sort of have started working on this recipe, I've discovered that it's actually really delicious if you take care of it in the correct way. So, we're going to be taking a look at some of those things and how to sort of approach the use of tomatoes in a savory dish like what we're doing today. So if you have any questions, feel free and drop your questions in the chat. I don't know everything about chow mein or stir fries or wok cooking or Chinese cooking or anything in general, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative or at the very least entertaining to watch. As with pretty much everything that we cook on stream, there is a recipe that goes along with this particular version of tomato beef chow mein. It was a recipe that I had written back actually, I don't remember how long ago it was, but it came out over on the YouTube channel. That was last Friday. So the recipe for the YouTube channel has a new recipe that comes every Friday. So last Friday we did the recipe for this particular tomato beef chow mein. So if you're looking for those recipes, they always live over there. That's very useful. Those tend to be pretty useful if you're trying to cook what we're cooking yourself, because they tend to move a little bit slower, and we kind of talk through some of the things that we're doing, and I don't quite ramble as much. So that can be a useful resource if you're trying to cook the things that we're cooking. Let's see. What else should I say? Yeah, okay, so as with pretty much everything that we cook, or at least all of the savory things that we cook, I'm starting off by crushing and mincing. That's 4 cloves of garlic, followed by, this is going to be about an inch or about a tablespoon's worth of finely minced ginger. So the reason that we start off with these 2 ingredients so often is not necessarily because everything needs to taste like garlic and ginger, but more because we're trying to build layers of umami, and as we work with umami in a stir fry, they tend to be the very first 2 things that go into the stir fry, sort of as what we call the aromatic elements of a stir fry, because as the name implies, we're looking for their aromatic qualities. So for the garlic, all I did was I gave it a good crush, and that's about all you really need to do for garlic. Once you give it a good crush, it pretty much will just start falling apart after that. You don't need to do too much else. For the ginger, though, you'll notice I am being a little bit more thorough and going for our fine mince here. That's because ginger is a little bit more durable, which means that if you don't get it a proper mince on it, it will absolutely have large chunks of ginger in your stir fry, which is not going to be super fun. So try and be thorough with that stuff. All right. Then next up is our green onions here. So as with a lot of the times that we use, not every time that we use green onions, but many of the times that we're working with green onions, you will see me do this. What we're going to do is separate the whites and greens of our green onions. So, a little bit wonky, okay. The reason that we oftentimes will separate the whites and greens of our green onions is because they have 2 very, very different qualities about them. So the whites of your green onion are a little bit more durable. They're very, very thick. They're more of the quality of a regular old sweet white onion, which makes it very, very useful to throw into a wok fry directly into the heat, which is nice and useful because in a lot of those scenarios you can bloom out a lot of aromatic quality from them. So if we throw them in, say, with our other aromatics, so our garlic and ginger, they will be very useful because we can get a lot of aromatic flavor from them. With the grains of a green onion, however, you can't quite do the same thing because they're very, very leafy, sort of how a kind of like cabbage or like spinach. And since they're so leafy, they're also a little bit more delicate. And since they're more delicate, if we were to throw them straight into our wok fry, we would get they would pretty much just fall apart, and we would have this very, very kind of like wilted. It would kind of feel like we threw wilted spinach into a wok fry, which is not great. So when we're working with the greens of our green onion, we generally want to treat them a little bit more delicately, or else you're gonna have kind of like mushy green onions. So to that end, what I'm doing here, not quite enough green onions. What I'm gonna do here is I'm going to slice up the greens of my green onions separately. So we're slicing these up on the bites. And then we're going to set these aside. They're actually not going to get into our wok fry at all. So these are going to go into our dish, very final, as our finishing garnish. Courtney, how's it going? Yeah. Ooh, a wonton soup. Yeah, that's probably on the to-do list. I should probably do that. I have made wonton soup many times. What I usually like doing when I make wonton soup, because I'm always really lazy with wonton soup, is I usually end up just using frozen wontons. But definitely like making fresh wontons, that's probably on the to-do list of things that I should do a recipe for. Or like a spicy wonton soup, or like something interesting. I would like to do something interesting with wonton soup. There are just like a whole bunch of types of dumplings that I'd like to do, but I just like, there are so many things that I've been working on that I can't do them all. But yes, wonton soup for sure on the to-do list. All right. Next up is our tomatoes, which, as you will notice, we are using fresh tomatoes because I could get fresh tomatoes. You don't have to use fresh tomatoes. A lot of times, if you can't find fresh tomatoes, like for example, if tomatoes are not in season, as they happen to be in season right now, we're using fresh ones. But if they're not in season though, you can totally use canned stuff. A lot of recipes I've even seen will call for canned stuff. I actually prefer using fresh tomatoes rather than an out-of-season tomato. So in the 21st century, you can get a tomato pretty much any time of year. That's because of crazy genetics and weird things that they do to the tomatoes to make them available year-round. But if you're not familiar, a tomato only grows in a very small portion of the year. And they also spoil very quickly. So really the only time that you should be eating a tomato when it's fresh is probably right around now, usually late spring through like early fall. Maybe like into the fall. But after that, they're probably not going to taste great because what they do in order for those tomatoes to arrive fresh at your grocery store is they pick them before they're ripe and then they let them ripen in transit. So what happens when you do that is you end up with a tomato that will look like this. It's very bright red, looks very nice. But what it actually tastes like is an unripened tomato because it was picked before it was ripened, which is not great because then you have, a lot of times I'll end up with tomatoes that just don't taste like anything at all. A lot of times I'll have tomatoes that are like way under ripened and just like not really a great tasting tomato. So when you're working with a tomato, especially in a scenario like this where we're just going to be wok frying it, if you can't find fresh tomatoes, you could totally just use canned tomatoes because the way that they treat canned tomatoes is they pick them at their peak ripeness and then they can them when they're at their peak ripeness. So it will be canned, so it's going to have the texture of a canned tomato, but it's going to have a lot more flavor to it because it was picked at the proper time, which is going to be a little bit more useful, especially in this case because we're going to be cooking it. So in our case today, I actually was able to get some fresh tomatoes that looked pretty decent, which is not always the case, but if you can't find it, I actually have some. I like to look for this stuff, whole Roma tomatoes usually. Those are really good for pasta sauces, stuff like that. We'll generally say that it's peeled. You don't have to peel the tomatoes for this particular recipe. You can if you want to. What will happen if you don't peel the tomatoes is the skin of the tomato starts separating, and then you get like a little bit of like the skin of the tomato will start coming off into the wok fry. If you don't mind that, I don't mind that. It will still be okay. But if that does bother you, you can absolutely just peel the tomato, and it peels the same way that you would peel anything else. Just get a potato peeler and peel that skin off. Ooh, egg drop soup, yeah. We did I haven't done an egg drop soup yet, or I haven't done a recipe for an egg drop soup yet. But we did do a Westlake soup, which is kind of like a fancy egg drop soup, and we talked a lot about like what exactly is an egg drop soup. Because an egg drop soup is really nothing. It's basically just like broth plus an egg, and that's really it. If your egg drop soup has anything else in it, it's not an egg drop soup anymore. It's something else. And that's also the reason why you get it for free in restaurants a lot, is because it's really, really simple. It's literally just stock plus an egg. So what we did on the channel, I want to say that was like back in December or so, is a Westlake soup, which is like a really, really fancy. It has like ground beef in it, plus tofu and cilantro. Has a lot of cilantro in it. So that's a fun one if you're looking for egg drop soup. Cool, how much? Okay. Next up, so this is a sweet white onion. I'm gonna go for a relatively large dice here. And in order to go for a large dice, what we always do, I always like to remind folks, is that when we're going for a large dice, what we're doing is leaving this root on. And what's gonna happen is that root is holding the onion together, so it's not gonna fall apart, which is very useful when you go for your dice. Because if you've ever tried to dice an onion and have it come apart while you're dicing, that's not super fun because it sort of just like starts falling apart in your hand. So what we do is we leave that root on. Here's the remaining root, and you can toss that. And it holds the whole onion together while you cut. Very useful. All right, so our last veggie for today is probably the one thing that I don't like. But so what we're going with today is a green bell pepper. So if you've ever had tomato beef chow mein, or really any kind of Chinese dish that has a tomato in it and another veggie, you'll probably see this green bell pepper. But I'm almost positive that the reason that you see green bell peppers in tomato beef chow mein, you also see it in things like tomato egg stir fry, or like other like all kinds of like savory tomato dishes that come from Chinese food. The reason that you see this green bell pepper is because it's really pretty. That's why people put it in there, is because it has this nice color contrast relative to the red tomatoes. So if you were to throw like a yellow bell pepper or a red bell pepper in, it would look kind of weird because it's the same color as the tomato. But the problem that I have with it is that green bell peppers are disgusting and I hate them. But the reason for that is because green bell peppers, the way that you get a green bell pepper is that they pick it before it's ripe. So what a green bell pepper is essentially a red bell pepper that has not yet ripened yet. So what that means is, as you can imagine, because it was picked before it was ripe, is that it's really, really bitter because it's not ripe yet. Which I don't know why these things exist, but it does. So, and here we are, we're using it because it's going to look really, really pretty, and it's probably going to work out okay because we're going to fry the hell out of it. But if it were up to me and if I didn't care about how this looked, I would probably use something. I would use maybe a yellow bell pepper, or maybe even an orange bell pepper. That might taste a little bit better. And it wouldn't be nearly as bitter as this gross green bell pepper is about to be. All right. So what I am doing though is I'm going for a pretty large dice here. And that's to make sure that these things stay together in the wok fry and are relative to the same size as the other vegetables that are going to go into our wok fry, which will be our onions and our tomatoes. So I'm paying attention to the size of my dice here and making sure that these stay relatively large, otherwise we're going to have weird bites. Yeah, why not go with another green veg? We could do that. I went back and forth on that. As it happens, so the reason that we're going with the green bell pepper, and actually the main reason that we're doing it today, is because as much research as I could possibly do, I discovered that I don't think I have ever seen a tomato beef chow mein done without a green bell pepper. It's like 100% of every tomato beef chow mein recipe that I saw has a green bell pepper in it, and I'm positive it's because it looks really pretty. So yeah, I guess you probably could have used like bok choy. That probably would have tasted really good. But the internet would have gotten mad and like told me not do that. So here we are, we're doing it. But probably the next time that I make this, I'm probably not going to use that green bell pepper because they're gross. All right, Live dangerously, yeah. Cool. Okay, so next up, this is our steak. For the life of me, I have not been able to find flank steak at the market lately. For sure, the more appropriate thing to use would be flank steak. I guess you could use either flank steak or top cut sirloin. I usually like going with flank steak mostly because it's going to be a little bit cheaper. But top cut sirloin is going to do okay too. They have very similar properties. They're also very, very lean cuts. The top cut sirloin, lots of people like to eat it as like a steak, just like a steak with some mashed potatoes, so they tend to run a little bit more expensive. But they still have similar qualities, and I actually happen to get a pretty good deal on these flank steaks, so that will serve for our purposes too. How about a red bell pepper? Yeah, so that's what I was mentioning earlier. So you could absolutely use a red bell pepper. I actually think a red bell pepper would taste better. The reason that I think you don't see red bell peppers in a tomato, I mean, really any kind of Chinese stir fry that contains a tomato, is because it would look weird. So like it would be a red vegetable next to another red vegetable. And I think that's 100% of the reason why you don't see red bell peppers. I think it would absolutely taste better if you used a red bell pepper. It wouldn't be as bitter. It wouldn't have like as much like harsh qualities to it. It would probably stir fry a little bit better. Just everything about it would be better, but it wouldn't look as cool. It would make the whole dish look too red. So, and then you would need something like a brighter color to kind of contrast it. So. Yeah, can you marinate the steak ahead of time? Yes, that's what I was about to say. What I meant, so what we're going to do today is kind of a complicated marinade, and what I meant to do was this first so that it would have more time to marinate, but I forgot. So here we are. But what we're going to do is, we're going to do a steak marinade that comes from Cook's Illustrated, which is going to use some baking soda, which actually I think someone on the stream mentioned, asked if I ever do that, and we're going to do it today. But it actually takes some extra time, so I meant to do this first. In the recipe video, I actually did it first, but I forgot. So I might actually skip that today because I forgot. But yes, you can absolutely marinate the steak ahead of time. If you're paying attention, what you can do is get the steak marinade done very first, and that will have more time to marinate while you chop your other things. The main reason why I always forget to chop the steak first, so the reason that it's not the very, very first thing that gets on the cutting board, is that after you chop the steak, you then have to wash your cutting board. So ideally you want to not be doing that, but I forgot, so here we are. All right, so you'll notice, so I'm paying very close attention to, I've been looking at the grain of our steak, and what I'm trying to do is cut against that grain as much as possible. So what I'm noticing though is that the way that the steak has been cut by the butcher is in the direction of the grain where I'm gonna have to chop with the grain quite a bit. So the reason that we want to chop against the grain as much as possible is because the more that you chop with the grain, the more chewy that piece of steak is going to be going. So our grain is going downward in this direction, which is ideally what you want to do is not be chopping in this direction too much, because the more that you chop in that direction, the more that you're going to have to do in order to make those bites like chewable. Otherwise, they're going to get slightly chewy. So our grain is going in this direction, so I'm going to cut in this direction as much as possible. The other thing that we want to pay attention to, so you'll notice that my steak has a lot of white bits, so it kind of looks like it's fat, like this stuff. This is not fat. It would be if we were dealing with something like a New York strip steak or something like that, or like a filet mignon, other kind of steak like that. That white bit, it definitely would be fat. What this is today, though, since we're working with top cut sirloin, you'll notice my knife just slipped on it too. This is actually tendon, and it's really, really chewy and borderline inedible. So what you want to do is make sure that you don't leave that stuff in. And if you're paying attention at the butcher shop, you should try and look for a cut of meat that contains as little of that white stuff as possible, because it's not edible. Or I guess it is edible, but it's not really edible for our case today. I definitely have a sister-in-law that likes to eat that stuff, but I hate it, so. Hey, there's Hamcharo. That's Hamcharo, everyone. Hamcharo is the hamster that eats ramen. He only gets to eat every time that someone subscribes on YouTube, so please subscribe on YouTube. He's very hungry. Yeah. How frequently do I sharpen my kitchen knives? Oh, that's a good question. So I actually have two of these knives. so I don't sharpen them as frequently as you would expect. I probably only sharpen them once every like 2 or 3 months or so. I've been sharpening them more regularly because I've been doing a lot of prep cooking lately. But yeah, I actually have 2 of them, so I don't sharpen them nearly as much as I would have to if I was using only one of them. But I actually have 2 identical knives, so I switch them out. And they go dull probably after like, kind of depends on how much chopping I've been doing, but usually within like max probably like 2 months or so, and then it's going to be dull. Like, yeah, fat or cartilage? Yeah, that's the real question. So all of this stuff right here, this might be fat actually because it's in between. But generally, when you see white bits in a flank steak, or in this case in a top cut sirloin, it's not fat. It's cartilage, and it's not going to be fun to chew on. So once again, so I'm going to chop up the other half of my steak here, so you can pay attention. And you want to do, so what we're doing is I'm pulling apart. So let's pull this in a little bit. I'm pulling apart the steak, and we can see that grain. So here's the grain of the meat. It's going in this direction right here. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm chopping this way as much as possible, and that's going to help keep the steak nice and tender. So that's sort of a thing that we do a lot with steaks like this that have very little fat in it, because we're going to be contending with chewiness the whole time. So eventually, obviously, because of the shape of the steak, you are eventually going to have to cut with the grain. So I just did one cut with the grain going in this direction. But then, since I've chopped it correctly, and also I was paying attention to the direction of the grain when I bought this steak, now we can chop against the grain the rest of the way, like so. I should do a knife review with my meals. Oh yeah. Yeah, I don't know that I know enough about knives to do that. That would be fun. Yeah. There are definitely like other people on Reddit, like who cook live, that know more about knives than I do. Mostly what I pay attention to is like how it feels. I think that might be like the more important thing. How does it feel in your hand? Does it feel comfortable? And that's kind of like depends on you. Do you like it? You know. So what I always say, people ask me about knife recommendations all the time, and what I always say is that if you're looking for a good knife, or if you're like ready to spend some money on a knife, what I always recommend is that whatever you have, it's probably a fine knife. What's more important is that whatever the knife is that you are using, it should be very, very sharp. So before you invest in a nice knife, I recommend investing in a nice knife sharpening set. So get yourself a really, really solid whetstone, and then a pretty good, a really solid strop, and get yourself the gear that you need to make sure that that knife stays sharp, and that itself is probably going to run you close to $100 just to keep that knife sharp, and that's going to benefit your cooking a lot more than any kind of like fancy knife. So this knife is like this is like a fancy French knife, and it's like fun to use, and it's like nice to have and stuff. But before I had this knife, I was definitely using like a cheap Costco knife for like almost 10 years, I think, that I was using that cheap Costco knife, and it worked great. I got really comfortable with it. I knew like I was very comfortable with the way it was shaped and the way that it was like weighted. All of those things were very familiar to me, so like I loved using that knife until I upgraded it. What was more important was making sure that it was just very sharp. Yeah. Cool. It would make for a better review. Yeah, I guess that's true. It would mostly just be a review about like how I feel, like how I personally feel about that knife. It's not very unbiased, but yeah, it would be fun though. Cool. Would an acidic orange or pineapple marinade top around tenderizer? Yeah, that would be a good one. Maybe like some lime or something. I don't know that would be appropriate to the dish. But that definitely might work. I'm definitely gonna use some acid in our marinade right now. So what we're going to use is going to be a little bit of our acids are going to be wine. So we're going to use some alcohol and marinate this. That's going to definitely help. There's a couple of things that I like doing. So what I meant to do and then I forgot because I didn't do it early enough. Is I was going to add some baking soda, and this is something that comes out of a food science article from Cooks Illustrated, and I don't know anything about food science, so I'm not going to dive into that too much. But essentially, what that baking soda is going to do is it slows down the bonding time of the proteins in your steak, which essentially means is that as you sear it, it keeps the steak from turning like chewy. Which is useful when you're working with a cut like this, because when you sear it, it tends to get really, really rubbery. So I forgot to do that today because we would have needed to do it very, very first. So we're not going to do that today. But what we are going to do is add a little bit of cornstarch to our marinade, which is very, very useful. Yeah. Free knives for me. Yeah, I would accept free knives. That's for sure. That's true. All right, so here's our marinade. That's 4 tablespoons of soy sauce to start, followed by, let's see, there's brown sugar. It's going to be a single tablespoon of brown sugar. Oops. I love adding sugar elements to my marinades lately, especially the ones where it requires a sear, because the sugar helps crystallize a little bit in the sear, and I find that it's really, really useful to like sort of develop a nice caramelized sear. So I like adding a little bit of brown sugar to my marinades for that purpose. Next up is the acid that we were talking about. So this is a little bit of Shaoxing wine, and that's going to have a little bit of alcohol to it. That's going to help break down the marinade a little bit. Followed by, this is half a teaspoon of white pepper. More or less, that's a little bit of an eyeball. And finally, this is what we were mentioning earlier. This is going to be half a teaspoon of cornstarch. So we very, very often you will see cornstarch added to meat marinades in a lot of Chinese stir fries, actually just in a lot of like generally proteins. You'll see it in eggs a lot too. And that's the reason that you see that in marinades a lot, is because what it's doing is it's slowing down the exterior cook time of the thing you're cooking. So in this case, it's going to slow down the exterior cook of our steak just long enough, probably about like maybe 30-45 seconds, and it will help us like get the interior of our steak to cook all the way through. So it tends to be really, really helpful with things like chicken, where we really don't want to go for a undercooked piece of chicken. In a steak, it's okay if it's slightly rare because you have like a little bit more redness to your steak. But in this particular case, it's going to help keep the steak nice and tender. So as we sear it, it won't quite like turn into rubber as we're trying to get like a seared crispy quality. So that's really useful when we're going for a crispy steak, because if you go for a crispy steak and you don't have that cornstarch, what you'll probably end up with is like rubbery steak, which is not so good. Yeah. Oh, you eat sirloin daily, and you had to get top round. Yeah, top round it's like a lot more chewy, but it kind of depends on how you cut it. I think if you cut it correctly, and if you use it in the right context, it's still gonna taste okay. But it all depends. It depends on the context that you're using it in. Like for example, we use top cut sirloin today, which I love in this particular context because we're slicing it up, so it's gonna be really it's gonna sear really nicely. But if I were to try and do like a pan fry with that, if I like threw it in a cast iron, I think for sure it would be like kind of a chewy steak and like not great because it doesn't have enough fat in it. So I think steak, it all comes down to like the context that you're using it in, for sure. All right, so next up is going to be our sauce, and then we're going to head over to the stove. This is 4 tablespoons of soy sauce to start. Very often you'll see these sauce elements, they'll go into the wok fry, straight into the wok fry. So you'll see a lot of like wok chefs just dump the stuff straight in. That can be done most of the time that they're doing that. The reason that they can do that is because they're not really tasting anymore. They're mostly just cooking by like sight and feel. Which, if you're very familiar with a dish, you can absolutely do that. In our case today, we want to try and insert as many opportunities as possible to stop in tastes, so that we have a general idea of like what the thing that we're tasting actually tastes like. So it's very useful to assemble your sauce elements off heat, because if we were to do it straight into the wok fry, it's going to be a lot more tricky, and you're not really going to have an opportunity to taste. So you will very often will see me doing my wok stir fries with sauce elements that are assembled on the cutting board rather than in the wok. That was so 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, 1 tablespoon of rice vinegar, a tablespoon of dark soy sauce, and a tablespoon of oyster sauce. And then next is going to be our sweet element, and I have gone back and forth on whether or not to use these 2 elements. But I discovered that you really cannot make tomato beef chow mein without tomato. You have to have ketchup, I found. It is like kind of that quintessential flavor to what you're eating when you eat tomato beef chow mein. It's actually not the tomato, it's the sweetness that comes from the ketchup. So what I'm doing though is I'm going to cut that in half. So that's a single tablespoon of ketchup, and then this is going to be a single, 1 tablespoon of sweet chili sauce. And that's going to kind of like create a little, that's where all of the sweetness of our recipe is going to come from, are those 2 elements. Yeah. Alright, last up is going to be, this is 2 tablespoons of Chinese fermented chili paste, or doubanjiang. This is going to be where all of the heat comes from in our recipe. If you are particularly heat averse, you could leave it out entirely. It would probably be a little bit too sweet if you left it out entirely, but dial up or down this element as you need to, depending on how much sugar you want, or how much heat you want in your chow mein. Alright, I'm rounding this off. This is going to be about half a cup. I don't think this is actually half a cup because I'm out of stock. But that's, I think we're using beef stock today. If you don't like beef stock, you could use chicken stock, you could use lamb stock. I used pork stock once. Whatever kind of stock that you want. What we're really looking for though is the thickness that comes from the cartilage that comes from the stock. So this is going to help us create like a more of a thick sauce. If you don't have any stock, you could also totally just use water and supplement it with a little bit of cornstarch, which is what we're going to do next. Alright, so the very last thing that we're going to put together here is our noodles. So, more like a quarter cup, yeah, roughly. So these are our fresh noodles. So these are fresh chow mein noodles, so I guess you would call that lo mein. These are fresh round noodles though. What's really important to pay attention to when you are using fresh noodles like this, this is going to be just as true if you were using like fresh pasta, is that it's really delicate. So this is not going to cook in the same way if you were using like dry fettuccine or dry spaghetti, where you could throw it into a boiling pot of water and then it cooks for like 8-10 minutes. Because this stuff is fresh, it is going to cook for a very short amount of time. So I usually let that stuff go for no more than 2 minutes. And this is going to be true anytime that you're cooking something that cooks in 2 minutes, is that we want to pay attention to how quickly we stop the cook time. So really anything that you're cooking, but especially anything that's boiled, has the potential to continue to cook after you pull it off heat. So that's what we call carryover cook. And carryover cook is essentially the fact that when you take something off heat, it has more heat potential in it as it's like pulled off of the heat. That's true for really anything that you're cooking. But with pasta in particular, that's really important, especially if it's going to cook in 2 minutes. We have to be able to account for that carryover time. So in order to make sure that it doesn't overcook in its carryover, what we're going to do is set up an ice bath here. So this is just plain old water with a whole bunch of ice. And what we're going to do is when that when our noodles are done cooking is I'm going to drop it into this ice bath, and it's going to stop that cooking time immediately. So, without this ice bath, what would happen is that I would cook it for 2 minutes. It would be perfectly cooked as soon as I pulled it out, and then it would continue to cook, and then when we get to eating it, it would become overcooked because it overcooked in the carryover, which is not great. So remember, anytime that you're cooking fresh noodles like fresh lo mein or fresh chow mein or Shanghainese round noodles, other stuff like that, make sure that you set up an ice bath before you move over to the stove. Otherwise, you're gonna have overcooked noodles. Not fun. All right, so over on the stove, I've got a pot of water. This has been rolling over on the side burner. What we're gonna do is we're gonna drop our noodles in for 2 minutes exactly. So we're gonna let that go for 2 minutes, and then, I mean 2 minutes. And when I say 2 minutes, I mean literally 2 minutes, so set a timer. Don't eyeball this stuff, make sure that you set a timer, or you can absolutely overcook these noodles. And if you've ever had overcooked noodles, they are not fun. It's just gonna be a gloopy hot mess, and you will probably not even be able to eat it. So set a timer, I really mean it, set a timer. So that should be, I actually didn't weigh it, I kind of just assumed. But that should be a pound of noodles, so that should be 16 ounces. I think it was 16 ounces. What's my favorite noodle type? Ooh. Lately it's been this stuff, which is lo mein. Less lately, I've also been really into chow fun, which is my least favorite noodle to cook, but it is my most favorite noodle to eat because it's so delicate and tasty. I've also been really into like pad thai noodles, which are usually chow fun noodles, but they're cut more thinly. Yeah. But yeah, lately I've been eating a lot of lo mein, so I actually love these noodles. I get them at the store around the corner from me, which sells them fresh, which is really cool, because I'm pretty sure actually they're buying it from the noodle shop that's a block down, so I probably could just like walk an extra block and get them from the noodle shop. Maybe like shave 5% margin off of what I'm paying for them, but oh well. I'm lazy. Yeah. Cool, so this is at minute 47. I'm gonna let that go for another 10 seconds, and then we'll pull it off. Yes, should switch the cameras. So a couple of things to note about the way that we just cooked these noodles. That's gonna be very, very different from Italian cooking. Probably the main thing that you'll notice that we just did is that we didn't salt the pasta water at all. So that's a real big thing in a lot of Italian cooking, is that you heavily, heavily salt your pasta water. And the reason for that is because the pasta water is very, very important in a lot of Italian cooking. It comes up in a lot of stuff. It's basically how you make like thick carbonara sauces and thick bolognese sauces. It's really, really important because it has all of that starch quality to it, so you reserve that pasta water and then you add it to your sauce, and it's how you create thick sauces. So that is not a thing that you really do in Chinese cooking, so we did not bother salting the pasta water. I pretty much just boiled water and then threw it into the sink. We're not preserving it because we're not going to use that water. So the other thing that we just did is that I also didn't reserve any water for the same reason. But so essentially what we're doing in replacement of salting that pasta water is we're going to do a couple of things, but mainly what we're going to do is, let's make sure this is empty first. We're going to season our noodles, so this is really, really important because we're also going to be stir frying them. So this is not something that you will probably ever see in any kind of Italian cooking. But what we're going to do is we're going to wok fry these noodles. But in order to make sure that they wok fry properly and have some kind of flavor to it, we're also going to marinate them. So this is a little bit of an extra step. You maybe don't have to do it. You could probably get away without doing it if you really, really wanted to. But I highly recommend doing it because it's going to give you a little bit more depth of flavor. And it also helps the noodles crisp up too. So that was 2 tablespoons of sesame oil and 2 tablespoons of dark soy sauce. And then I'm just going to give this a toss. And that dark soy sauce, actually both the dark soy sauce and the sesame oil, they're very, very pungent. So they're going to coat those noodles really, really well, especially because of that oil. So you'll notice we're getting that nice dark color to our noodles already. That kind of looks like something you could already eat. Yeah. Alright, let's let this go. And that is our noodles. So we're going to wok fry these. These are going to come up in a little bit, probably in like 10 minutes. Then over on the stove, I've got my wok heating up. We're going to let that get going. It probably needs about a minute before it's ready to go. And we're going to start searing our steak. Cool. Yeah. I think measurements look easy. Yeah, I guess that's true. That's probably because I don't measure super carefully. The spoons that I'm using are not measuring spoons. They're really just regular spoons. They're like soup spoons. I actually checked on it once because someone asked me to, and I think they're like just slightly smaller than a tablespoon. So I think they're like maybe like 10 grams short of a tablespoon. So whatever that's worth. But for the most part, the reason that I don't bother with getting, actually the main reason I don't bother with getting like actual tablespoons out is because I don't have enough to do that. I only have like 1 tablespoon, and I would have to like, you'll probably notice, but I go through like 10 spoons in this, like in a given stream. That's because we're like dealing with meat and we're dealing with different qualities of sauces. I would have to go back and like clean those spoons all the time. But the real reason that I don't like measuring super closely is because it's not going to really benefit very much. Mainly what I like doing is stopping and tasting. So I like to, the way that I measure is more based on the way that it tastes and also the way that it looks. So if the color is off, or if it's not quite, the texture is off, I'm paying more attention to that stuff rather than how much of each ingredient did I add or did I measure it incorrectly. More concerned with how it actually looks and tastes. So, and I actually think that's like a really important way to approach pretty much any recipe, because I feel like that's how most recipes are written, is that it's based off of how it looks, feels, and tastes, and like the texture and all of those things. Like feel, it's coming from feel. And whoever wrote that recipe is like quantifying that into some kind of like amount, so into tablespoons and cups and grams and ounces and stuff. But that's all of that stuff that's happening in the recipe that you're reading is happening after the fact. So it may or may not be accurate because they're like adding it up after the fact. So whether or not it's going to be accurate is all down to like how it feels. So what I always say when people follow my recipes is you can follow it to a certain extent, but after a certain point you're going to have to start making those decisions on your own, and that's going to be where like intuition in cooking comes in, rather than just like blindly following a recipe. Cool. Hello to everyone just tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wonton Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're here every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST. With new recipes out over on my YouTube channel every Friday. So last Friday we came out with a recipe for a tomato beef chow mein, which is a type of chow mein that relies very heavily on the use of fresh tomatoes. That recipe already lives over on my YouTube channel, so if you haven't checked that channel out yet, that lives over there. If you're watching on Reddit, that's the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on YouTube, it's the channel you're already on. Those are out every Friday. In addition to that, that's also where the concurrent live stream lives. So this one that's going behind me, that's where that's going. So if you were over there, you probably would have known maybe 3.5 weeks ago that we'd be doing this stream. So lots of folks already knew that we'd be doing this one. So if you're looking for that stuff, that's a good place to be. We're working our way to 4,500 subscribers by the end of the month. So if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and subscribe. There will be a hamster that eats ramen. His name is Hamcharo, and he only gets to eat when you feed him. So please feed him. He's very hungry. All right, so first up, I'm adding my peanut oil here. We want to go pretty heavy here. That should be about 4 tablespoons. And then we're going to add our steak. What we're doing is our sear here. So I'm going to add this flat side down, a piece at a time. So just like any time that we're searing here, I'm being very careful. I'm not just going to dump this straight into the wok, because if we were to do that, we wouldn't necessarily be able to make sure that we're getting a lot of surface area in contact with the wok. And that is really, really important in this case because everything that's touching the wok is going to develop a sear. So if it's positioned incorrectly, so for example, if our steak was folded over or like bunched up in a weird way, it wouldn't sear properly, and that's going to give us kind of a mushy quality to our steaks. So in the effort of making sure that our steak is nice and crispy, we want to add this stuff one piece at a time. As painstaking as it seems. Probably should be using tongs, but I'm not. Oh well. yeah. Cool. So what I'm using today, so my wok is a round bottom wok, so you'll notice that all of the oil is pooling up right here. So what I like to do when I have my round bottom wok for searing is give that wok a rotate. And that's just going to move the oil around so to make sure that that we get a nice even sear going. So if we don't rotate it, the oil doesn't reach up here, and then we end up with like burnt steak instead of like nice crispy steak. So if you want, you can also get like a cast iron pan or some kind of heavy bottom skillet out. Anything that's flat, it will probably work a little bit better. The main reason that I do this in the wok is because I don't feel like cooking in clean two pans. So that's probably the main motivation for many things that I do. But I don't want to do the dishes. But yeah, so what we're doing here is we're going to let that sit for 2.5 minutes. I also forgot to set a timer, so I think there's about a minute left. But every once in a while, I'm going to give this wok a rotate and kind of let that oil sort of reach the exterior to make sure that my steak doesn't start burning on that outside. Yeah. Also, the steak is going to start shedding some fat too, so you'll notice that there's even more oil starting to pool up at the bottom because fat is starting to come off of our steak, which is nice. But, so the real key to a good solid sear is actually not the oil. What the real key is you've got to stop moving it. So if you've ever had trouble getting your steak to sear, actually this is true for anything that you're trying to sear. So this is also true for any kind of crispy fried rices that I've done or anything that you're trying to get to sear, is you've got to stop moving it. So the more that you move something, the less sear that you're going to get. So the more that you check it and like poke at it and check it and like if you're not sure if it's searing properly or if you start getting really anxious and you start moving it around, that's when your steak stops searing properly because you moved it too much. So if you want to make sure that it sears properly, you've got to stop moving it. Otherwise, you're going to have either burnt or mushy steak, which is not good. Yeah, cool. Thanks. Oh, I'm glad you're learning something. I'm glad people learn things on this stream. All right. Cool. So I'm going to be doing this in batches today. So this should be one of, I think it should be 2 batches. We'll see. We'll see how long many batches this takes. I'm going to pull that out and then we're going to add a little bit more oil and do our second batch. So we're going to do the exact same thing. Laying this a piece at a time and making sure that everything gets nice solid contact with the bottom of the wok. So just like I was doing before, I'm laying everything. This is the largest surface area of the steak is facing downward. And mainly our goal here is to make sure that nothing is stacked on top of itself, or else it's not going to sear properly. Alright. Can we fit everything? Do it. All right, that should do it. Yeah, cool. So, like we did with our first batch, we're going to rotate the oil here just to make sure that everything reaches the exterior or the outer rim of our wok burner here. While that's going, we can take a look at our finished steak. Not if the camera is off. It is. So here's our first batch. And what we're looking for is these nice crispy bits and pieces. So this is where we're looking for all this nice sear. That's coming from all of the different, first, I think the first thing that it comes from is all of the sugar that we included in our marinade. That's really useful. But really where it's coming from is that nice long sear. So we leave it undisturbed for a full 2.5 minutes. And that's where that sear is going to come from. So we're gonna let that go for another minute and change, just to make sure that we get a good solid sear going, and then we'll pull it out and move on. What are we making? Yeah, today, hello to everyone just tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wonton Cook. If you are just now tuning in, today we're doing a tomato beef chow mein, which is a form of chow mein that relies very heavily on the use of tomato. So today we're using fresh tomatoes, but you can also absolutely do it with canned tomatoes. The main reason I'm doing it with fresh tomatoes today is because I was able to find fresh tomatoes at the market that were decently ripened. If you can't find ripened tomatoes, you can also do it with canned tomatoes. So if tomatoes are not in season, they happen to be in season right now here in California, but if they're not in season, go out and use some canned tomatoes and it will work just as well. With a dish like this, especially with a dish like this, you can absolutely get away with using the canned stuff because you're just going to be cooking it off anyway, so it's not going to really matter too much. If it's kind of mushy or a little bit soggy, we're just going to be cooking it down anyway, so we're cooking out all of the moisture anyway. So actually, at the end of the day, if you're I would actually prefer using canned tomatoes rather than unripened or poorly ripened tomatoes or out of season tomatoes, because they just taste better. Alright. Nice little flame up there. Cool. Yeah, what else? Oh yeah. If you were subscribed to the YouTube channel, we have new recipes coming out every Friday. So last Friday was the recipe for this tomato beef chow mein. So every Monday following that Friday, we usually will be cooking through those recipes. So today we're cooking through the recipe that came out last Friday, which already lives over on the YouTube channel, and I forgot to link it. There it is. So if you're looking for that stuff, that already lives over on my YouTube channel, which is over here. And here is the recipe. And I will try not to forget to link that stuff. All right. So once we're done searing our steak, there's all of this nice caramelized stuff here. In Italian cooking, we would call this fond. We don't want to leave that stuff behind in our particular case, because if we leave that behind, it will start burning, which is not great. So in some cases, in a lot of cases, that I do find myself using that stuff. In this particular recipe, though, we're not going to actually use that fond, which I know that it is kind of a bummer, because essentially what you're dumping when you dump out your fond is a lot of flavor. And that's all like steak fat and brown sugar, all that stuff. But we don't want that to stay in our wok because it will eventually just start to burn, which is not great. So before we move on, very, very important is to pull all of that stuff out of the wok, give it a clean, and give it a wipe down before you move on. Otherwise, you're going to have charred flakes in your wok fry, which is not great. So if we could take a look, this is all the stuff that we just cleaned out. We don't want that in our wok fry. It's going to be kind of gross. Kids love lo mein, yeah. When I was a kid, this was one that my mom used to order a lot. And it was never particularly one that I loved. And I think the main reason why I didn't like it was because I had a lot of vegetables in it, and I don't think I liked eating the vegetables. So I think the presence of tomatoes always just grossed me out. But now that I'm a grown-up, I actually love it because the tomatoes actually have a nice sweet quality to it and just bloom really well. All right, so I'm reheating my wok now that it's nice and clean, and we're gonna get going with our wok fry next. Yeah. Cool. All right, so as always, we're starting off. This is gonna be 4 tablespoons of peanut oil. Then we're gonna do our long yao, which is essentially coating the wok in that oil to make sure that we have that nice non-stick surface. And then what I'm going to do is I like starting off with the tomatoes for this one, because our real goal here is to cook off a lot of the water that's in these tomatoes. We want these to wilt up a little bit. So I find that it's really useful to start off with those tomatoes a little bit and give them a little bit of head start, maybe like a minute, maybe 2 minutes head start, to really like cook up and like shed some of that moisture. Yeah. So what we're going to do today, and this is something that you'll see me doing very, very often in recipes that have a lot of ingredients like we are doing today, is we're going to be doing a lot of batch cooking. The reason that we batch cook a lot in recipes that have a lot of ingredients is because if you don't batch cook, what you're going to end up with is an underheated wok. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cook up our veggies. So that's going to be our tomatoes, our bell pepper, and then our onion. And then we're going to pull it out, and then we're going to cook our noodles. And then we're going to add everything back once we're done from there. So by making sure that at no point in time is everything actually in the wok at the same time, it keeps that wok nice and hot. So if you were cooking on a wok burner, I've actually done this on a wok burner before now, you wouldn't necessarily need to do that because obviously there's a lot of space in the wok. You can totally fit everything in. But without the really, really high heat that you get from a wok burner, it makes it a lot more difficult to actually get like crispy wok fried veggies or like crispy wok fried meats or proteins, because without that really high heat, you end up cooking on medium to medium low heat, and then you get more of it like a porridgey stir fry. So since we don't want that, that's not really great. We don't want porridge stir fries. We want to be cooking on high heat for the longest duration of time that we can possibly manage. So we're going to put off adding everything to the wok at the same time until the very, very end, and that's going to help us keep our wok nice and hot. So I'm starting off with our tomatoes here. What I'm really looking for here is just looking for some of that water to cook off from our tomatoes. So as you obviously, you probably know, tomatoes are made mostly of liquid, so that's what's going on inside. And that's what makes tomatoes so juicy. It's got all that juice inside. So what I like to do is let some of that juice cook off before we move on and add our aromatics. Then what we're going to do, so just like we do anytime that we are using our aromatics, is we still want to make sure that our aromatic elements make good contact with the wok. So, the reason that this is so important is because aromatics do not bloom their aromatic qualities unless they make contact with the wok surface. So if we were to throw it right on top instead of onto the side like I'm doing right now, what would happen is those aromatics, so that was my garlic, my ginger, and the whites of my green onions, they would end up steaming, which is not what we want to do. We want them to be frying in the wok oil. So in order to make sure that they actually properly fry, I'm moving things around in the wok to make sure that it makes good solid contact with that hot oil. Yeah. Next up, that's my bell pepper going in. Then we're going to let this go for maybe like 2 minutes or so. We're just looking to cook off a little bit of that rawness from those bell peppers, and then we're going to pull everything out and move on to our noodles. We'll need a bowl for it. Yeah, cool. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and remove these. You will notice there is one veggie that we have not yet added, which is our onions. I'm very intentionally holding those onions back because they are by far the most delicate vegetable that we're working with today. And we want to be sure that we don't overcook those onions, or else we'll get really, really mushy onions. So I like to undercook my onions as much as possible. We're going to hold those off. They're basically going to be raw onions as they get into the wok fry. Then next up, so this is my noodles going in. So we can pay attention to this actually. So I just noticed, so my wok is not super hot right now, and that's because I think we should have reheated before we added that oil, so you could listen. We don't have a lot of really aggressive heat going on, so it's not really sizzling like the way I want it to. So I'm gonna try and stop moving it so much, and that's gonna help bring out some of that heat back to my wok fry. Yeah. Cool. Get that wok hay, yeah. Paul, good question. Yeah, how do we keep the tomatoes firm and not mushy? So that's a good question. There are ways to do that. My goal right now is actually to get them a little bit on the mushier side, which is the same reason why I recommend, if you wanted to, you could also use canned tomatoes, which are already quite mushy. But what I'm really looking for is a lot of that juice to come out, so we could take a look. It's not on while this is cooking. Hopefully not sticking. All right, so here's our finished veggies, so we could take a look at our finished tomato. Like this. I would say it's not necessarily firm, but also not necessarily mushy. So it's got like this quality about it where it's like pretty firm to the touch, but when you bite into it, it is clearly not a raw tomato. And that's coming from a combination of things. But the main thing that it comes from it is by cooking for a very brief amount of time at a very high heat. So the same reason that we do for that, this applies to any vegetable that you cook in a wok. is that we want to be cooking those veggies at really, really high heat, so the highest possible heat that we can get our wok at a really, really short amount of time. So, and that's how you get that. Oops. That's how you get that quality of veggie. That's like pretty crispy but not raw. So what I always call it, just vegetables that are just at the raw stage is what we're looking for. All right. So that's our noodles. Last up is going to be our onions, which I'm going to do with our remaining veggies. I'm just going to give that a quick toss, and then we're going to add everything back. Ooh, a Wagyu, yeah. If someone sends me some Wagyu steak, I would absolutely do it. It would for sure cost like $100 at least to cook some A1. But yeah, if I got my hands on some really solid Wagyu steak, I would for sure be down to do that. I don't think I've ever spent much on any steak. Not even one that's cooked in a restaurant. I think the most that I've ever paid for any steak is maybe like $50-$60. And at least here in the Bay Area, like a cut of Wagyu steak, that'll run you probably close to $100, maybe even north of that. So I just have never had like the motivation to spend that much on a piece of steak. All right. So that's our onions. Here's my noodles going back in. Followed finally by my steak. And then last up is going to be our sauce element. What I always recommend when folks use the sauce element, especially if you're working with a sauce element that contains dark soy sauce because it is so concentrated, is that you don't want to go and drop all of that stuff in all at once. Because this is definitely the point where you can absolutely over-season a dish if you're not paying attention. So what I like to do is add it maybe like a quarter cup at a time, maybe even a little bit less than that, and then toss to combine and then check. If it needs all of it, you could add all of it, but if it doesn't need all of it, don't add all of it. Don't feel obligated to use all of your sauce element. And what I'm doing right now is I'm mainly paying attention to the color and texture of my noodles. I know what I'm trying to get here. But if you're not sure, also you could get a fork out and start tasting. This off. Put the damn sauce in, yeah. Yeah, it is tempting to just dump it all in. But I have definitely had situations where I have ruined an entire dish at the very, very end just by throwing everything in. So I did actually end up using all of it, but if you're not sure, especially in a dish like this, don't go dumping that whole thing in. And the last thing that we want to do every time that we finish cooking in a wok, especially carbon steel woks, is give it a rinse. Wash it down, clean it while it's hot. Carbon steel is a lot easier to clean when it's hot, so you can take a look. Here's my wok. I didn't actually clean anything, all I did was give it a quick rinse. And it's pretty much entirely clean. Almost everything came off. And that's because while carbon steel is hot, it's still a very non-stick surface. Once it cools down, you're going to have a lot more trouble cleaning that thing. So do yourself a favor, don't go and sit down and start eating right away, because when you come back to the wok after dinner and try and clean it, it's going to be a lot more tricky to clean. How to do it. Alright. Thank you. Oh yeah, it looks fire. Thank you. Am I near New York? I'm not, sadly. I live in Oakland, California. Maybe a food tour next. Should be coming up next. That'll be fun. Yeah. All right. How much would that if I sold it? Ooh, good question. If I were selling it, so I would always, so anytime I've discovered steak is really expensive, so it would probably be marked up, but not because it's particularly more tasty than something else on the menu. It would be marked up because the steak is really expensive. So I would probably, if this had chicken in it, if I was just doing like a tomato chicken chow mein, probably like 13, 14 bucks. If it was this version, if it had steak in it, probably like 17, 18. But only because it has that steak in it, and it's really, really expensive to buy steak. So what we just used, that was almost like $20 worth of steak, I think. So at cost, this probably would cost like probably close to $8 to cook anyway. Steak, very, very expensive. Yeah. What town represent? Yeah. Cool, let's try this out. Yeah. It's really good. I love this dish. A lot of like really interesting like depth of flavor and umami that's coming from all of the things that we just put in that sauce. So what really stands out to me is the dark soy sauce and the doubanjiang, which have this nice complementary quality about it, which is like very, very savory, but also very, very spicy. And like also that like ketchup and the sweet chili sauce is coming in and bringing in a lot of nice sugar elements. And then the steak is like really, really perfectly cooked because it's not too chewy, but also like not like particularly like toothsome. It has like a nice crispy quality from it from our sear. So, and I actually have been kind of on board with using top cut Angus more than flank steak, and like paying an extra, like maybe an extra $1 for it. But it's a little bit more expensive, but I actually think it's a little bit more tasty, and I almost forgot our chives. Okay, we'll see. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I don't know that I would really try this. Well, actually, it might be okay with chicken. But definitely, like, at cost, chicken is a lot easier to cook with. Anyone who has ever tried to assemble a menu will tell you that it is so much easier to cook with chicken than it is with anything that's red meat. So, like steak, lamb, even pork to some extent gets kind of expensive. Bacon is really, really expensive, but chicken is dirt cheap. So you could throw chicken in it. It's going to be close to the same cost as cooking something that's vegetarian. So as soon as some kind of meat is involved, though, it's like as soon as some kind of like red meat is involved, like steak, though, it starts piling up the cost. So like so our pop-up food booth is called Woo Can Cook. If you happen to live in Oakland, we're in the Alameda Point Antiques Fair every first Sunday, and then we're going to be starting at the Hayward Farmers Market every second and fourth Saturday. And the reason that we don't have any red meats in our menu is because it's just way too expensive. We would never be able to make a profit from anything with red meat in it. So everything that we sell is either like it's probably made from either bacon, pork, or chicken. And the reason for that is because there's just no profit margin on anything that has red meat in it, unless you get yourself a good source for steak that can sell it to you for very cheap. So I haven't found one yet, but as soon as I find one, I'll probably start adding things to the menu with steak in it. Yeah. You'll also notice that I'm very, very carefully picking around the green bell peppers because I think they're disgusting. But they look really pretty, for whatever that's worth. They certainly do look really pretty. But if you can imagine in your mind the green peppers, if they were yellow or orange, or especially if they were red, it would look kind of weird. It would look a little bit off balance. There wouldn't be quite enough brightness into it. There would be like red tomatoes next to red bell peppers next to like brown chicken or brown beef. It would be kind of off. The color palette would be off. It wouldn't present quite nicely. And I'm 100% positive that's the reason why green bell peppers are in everything that contains tomato in it. It's just because it looks really pretty. It has Christmas colors. So cool. Thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time catching one of these streams, we're here every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST with new recipes out over on my YouTube channel every Friday. So if you haven't checked out the YouTube channel yet, that's where all of the recipes live. So this particular recipe was one that came out over on the channel last Friday. So that already lives in a recipe form. It's part of a series that we've been doing that's inspired by TV and film. So this particular one comes from a clip from Will and Grace, where we kind of took a look at how to actually use chopsticks and why she eats noodles that way. So if you're interested in learning more about how chopsticks are supposed to be used, that's a good video to check out. Those videos, they're out every Friday. So last Friday was the recipe for this one. Friday before that was for a Chinese sweet dessert called jin dui, which is a sesame rice ball. Before that was, I forget. I forget what we did. But those recipes are coming out every Friday. So next Friday, the one coming up, we're gonna do a Korean kimbap, which is kind of looks like sushi. It's essentially sushi, but it comes from Korean food, and it has many, many different things in it. So it's basically a sushi roll with a barbecue steak in it, which is coming from Korean cuisine. So that one's coming out this Friday. And we'll be back here tomorrow cooking Shanghai Lion's Head meatballs. It's one of my favorite dishes when I was a kid. So new stuff coming out every Friday. What else? We're working our way to 4,500 subs by the end of the month. So if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and feed Hamcharo, who is the hamster eating ramen that you've probably seen popping up on the screen every once in a while. Take a bite. Oh yeah, I can absolutely take a bite. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be here doing dishes, so feel free and drop your questions in the chat. Hopefully I can swing back and answer folks. Yeah, if not, I'll see you tomorrow. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
You're as sweet as strawberry wine. You're bad, warm, glass of brandy, darling, I'll stay stoned on your love all the time.
Coming out of